The evening started like any other. A quiet dinner at home, me on my laptop, Lila scrolling through her phone. The air between us had grown colder over the months, the kind of silence that felt too heavy to break. I told myself it was just the ebb and flow of marriage, that we were in a rut, and that things would eventually get better. But in the back of my mind, there was a whisper, a quiet voice that told me something was wrong. I didn't pry into her phone or question her abrupt outings. After all, I was no saint in the secrets department. My own double life as an undercover FBI agent required me to be deceptive, to shield her from the truth. For years, I had justified it as protection. What she didn't know couldn't hurt her. But that night, everything changed. It happened by accident. I wasn't looking for trouble, wasn't trying to uncover a truth I wasn't ready to face. I had gone upstairs to retrieve a file I needed for a case, and as I passed by our bedroom door, I heard her voice. "Darling," she whispered, her tone dripping with affection. I froze. Lila didn't call me darling. Not anymore. Curiosity turned to dread as I stepped closer, careful to keep quiet. She was on the phone, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Yes, everything is ready," she said. "I've already told them where to find him. You just need to send the thugs, and it'll be done." My stomach dropped. I leaned against the wall for support, struggling to process what I had just heard. "Don't worry," she continued. "He's clueless. He won't see it coming." The woman I had married, the one I had vowed to protect, was plotting to kill me. And worse, she was doing it with another man. I didn't burst in or confront her. Years of FBI training had taught me the value of patience. Instead, I slipped away, my mind racing. Lila wasn't just cheating. She was conspiring to end my life. I went down to the basement, the only part of the house where I could think clearly. It was more than a storage space. It was my sanctuary, a place where I kept my equipment, my files, and my backup plans. I sank into the worn-out chair by my desk, staring at the wall of case files. My mind replayed her words, each one hitting like a bullet. The rage came first, hot and blinding. How could she do this to me? How long had she been planning this? But then, almost immediately, the anger gave way to clarity. This wasn't about emotions. This was about survival. I opened the secure laptop I kept hidden in the basement, accessing files that most people didn't even know existed. My cover as a mild-mannered logistics manager for a shipping company had worked for years, even with Lila. She had no idea that the man she thought was clueless and meek had been a combat officer before joining the FBI. My hands moved instinctively, pulling up surveillance software, setting up new cameras around the house, and accessing secure channels to contact my partner, Agent Sarah Carter. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Jason, what's going on?" "I need help," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's personal." There was a pause. Sarah wasn't used to me asking for help with personal matters. What kind of personal? I hesitated, then told her everything. Lila's affair, her plans to have me killed, and the man she was working with. Sarah's tone shifted immediately. "Jason, you need to get out of there." "No," I said firmly. "I'm not leaving. I'm going to handle this." "You're too close to this," she warned. "You're not thinking clearly." "I've never been more clear," I replied. "I need you to trust me, Sarah. Just have my back." After a moment of silence, she sighed. "Fine, but don't do anything reckless." I spent the rest of the night reviewing everything I knew about Lila and her routines. The cracks I had ignored for so long suddenly came into sharp focus. Her late-night texts, the new clothes, the way she avoided eye contact when we spoke. It all pointed to a woman who had checked out of our marriage long before this plot began. But why? Was it just greed? Did she want my money, my assets? Or was it something deeper, something I couldn't see yet? When I finally climbed into bed, Lila was already asleep, her face serene. It was a cruel irony. How someone plotting your death could look so peaceful. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, formulating a plan. Lila and her lover thought I was clueless, an easy target. They didn't know who they were dealing with. By the time this was over, they would understand exactly who I was. Because I wasn't just her husband. I was a combat-trained FBI agent, and I was ready for war. The next morning, I sat across from Lila at the breakfast table, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts while she sipped her coffee as if nothing had changed. I had spent the entire night piecing together her betrayal, replaying her phone conversation in my head. The woman who sat calmly in front of me, wearing the same innocent smile I had fallen for years ago, was plotting my murder. "Any plans today?" she asked casually, glancing up from her phone. I kept my face neutral, masking the storm brewing inside. "Just work," I replied. "What about you?" "Oh, nothing much," she said, her tone light. "I might meet up with Monica later." Monica, her best friend, one of the few people in her life I hadn't trusted from the start. I wondered how deep her involvement went. Was she just a confidant, or did she know everything? I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "Sounds nice. Tell her I said hi." Once Lila left the house, I went straight to the basement, locking the door behind me. The surveillance cameras I had installed overnight were already active, streaming footage from every corner of the house to my laptop. I pulled up the feed from Lila's phone. The spyware I had installed wasn't something an average person could detect, and it allowed me to see her texts, call logs, and emails in real time. The first message I intercepted that morning was from her lover. "Evan, how's our plan coming along? Beautiful?" Her reply came almost instantly. "He has no idea. We'll talk more tonight. I'll call you after dinner." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Evan. The name alone was enough to make my blood boil, but I couldn't let anger cloud my judgment. I needed to know more about him, who he was, what he wanted, and how far he was willing to go. By the afternoon, I had everything I needed to know about Evan. His full name was Evan Harris, and he wasn't just some charming playboy. He was a professional con artist with a trail of destruction left in his wake. Using my FBI resources, I uncovered a long list of scams he had orchestrated. He targeted wealthy women, charming them into leaving their husbands or partners and siphoning off their wealth before disappearing. But this time, it seemed he had gone a step further. Evan wasn't just after my money, he was after my life. Later that evening, I followed Lila to one of her meetings. She thought she was clever, making excuses to leave the house, but I had been tracking her movements for weeks. She met Evan at a quiet cafe downtown. I stayed in my car, watching them through binoculars as they leaned in close, their heads almost touching. From the way she smiled at him, you'd think he was the love of her life. The way he looked at her, though, told a different story. It wasn't love, it was control. I pulled out my phone, snapping pictures of them together. Evidence. When Lila returned home that night, she acted as if nothing was amiss. She kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and even offered to make me tea. I played along, keeping my responses short and my demeanor unbothered. As she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I watched her from across the room. She was good at pretending, better than I had given her credit for. But now I knew the truth, and there was no turning back. The next day, I brought everything I had learned to my FBI partner, Sarah Carter. Sarah's reaction was immediate. "Jason, this is serious. You're not just dealing with a cheating spouse. This is a criminal conspiracy." "I know," I said, handing her the photos of Lila and Evan. "That's why I need your help." She scanned the documents, her brow furrowing. "Evan Harris. I've heard of him. He's been on our radar for years, but we've never had enough to nail him." "Well, now we do," I said, my tone grim. "He's not just conning Lila. He's trying to have me killed." Sarah looked up at me, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "What's your plan?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "I'm going to let them think they're winning. I'll play the clueless husband until the last possible moment. Then, I'll take them both down." She nodded slowly. "All right, but you need to be careful, Jason. You're too close to this." "I've been close to danger before," I said. "This time, it's personal." Over the next few days, I continued gathering evidence. I tracked Evan's movements, monitored his communications with Lila, and even intercepted a phone call between him and a third party, one of the thugs Lila had mentioned. The more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Evan wasn't just a con artist. He was part of a larger criminal network led by a man named Victor Kane, a notorious figure in the underworld. Lila had no idea who she was dealing with. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to dismantle Evan's operation and tie him to Victor Kane. But I wasn't ready to act, not yet. I needed to catch them in the act, to ensure there were no loose ends. Lila and Evan thought I was a clueless, oblivious husband. But soon, they would learn exactly who I was. And by the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late. The more I dug into Lila and Evan's plans, the clearer it became that I couldn't just confront them. Confrontation would give them the upper hand, let them spin their web of lies, and force me into a corner. No, this required precision, patience, and the kind of focus I hadn't used since my combat days. As I watched Lila move through our house, smiling, chatting, and pretending everything was fine, I felt a mixture of anger and pity. She had no idea who I really was. Not the husband she thought she could outsmart, nor the man who had faced enemies far more dangerous than her lover. My double life had always been a burden, but now it was my greatest weapon. That morning, I received a secure message from Sarah Carter, my FBI partner. She tracked down more information on Evan Harris, including his ties to Victor Kane, the leader of a sprawling criminal syndicate. Victor Kane wasn't just a name whispered in dark alleys. He was a man who thrived on chaos, running everything from illegal arms deals to high-level cons. Evan was one of his top operators, a charmer who preyed on wealthy women and their unsuspecting spouses. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger than Lila's betrayal. I sat in my basement office, reviewing the files Sarah had sent me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lila and Evan had no idea they were plotting against a man trained to outthink and outmaneuver threats. I had spent years building a reputation as a mild-mannered logistics manager, a role designed to keep my FBI cover intact. But now, that cover felt like a cage. For the first time, I considered what it would mean to drop the facade, to let Lila see the real me. The combat officer who had survived war zones, the FBI agent who had infiltrated drug cartels and human trafficking rings. But I wasn't ready for that yet. Not until I had everything I needed to bring them down. Later that afternoon, I followed Lila to one of her shopping trips. She had become predictable in her routines, which made tracking her easy. This time, she met Evan at a private residence, a sleek, modern apartment that screamed money and danger. I parked a safe distance away, using a parabolic microphone to listen in on their conversation. From my vantage point, I could see them through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lila looked nervous, wringing her hands as she spoke, while Evan lounged on the couch, radiating confidence. "You're sure everything's set?" Evan asked, his voice smooth and commanding. Lila nodded. "Yes. He has no idea. I've made sure he won't suspect anything." "Good," Evan said, his smile cold. "Victor won't tolerate mistakes. You don't want to disappoint him." The mention of Victor's name sent a chill down my spine. Lila was deeper in this than I'd thought. She wasn't just betraying me. She was aligning herself with a criminal empire. That evening, I returned home before Lila, giving myself time to process what I'd learned. As I sat in the living room, staring at the photos I'd taken of her and Evan, I felt a pang of regret. This wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. It was about the life we had built, the years we had spent together, and the realization that it had all been a lie. When Lila finally walked through the door, her smile felt forced, her movements tense. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She nodded, setting down her purse. "Yeah, Monica and I went shopping. It was exhausting." I forced a smile, playing the part of the oblivious husband. "Glad you had fun." As she moved past me, I watched her carefully, noting the way her shoulders stiffened under my gaze. She was hiding something, but she didn't realize that I already knew what it was. The next day, Sarah and I met in person at a secure location. She had mapped out Victor Kane's operation, connecting the dots between Evan, Lila, and the syndicate. "We're dealing with more than just a con," Sarah said, spreading out the files on the table. "Victor's syndicate is tied to multiple murders, money laundering, and high-level corruption. Evan is a key player, but he's not the mastermind. Victor is." "And Lila?" I asked, my voice hard. Sarah hesitated. "She's complicit, Jason. Whether she realizes it or not, she's part of this." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. I had hoped, deep down, that Lila was just a pawn, that she had been manipulated into this mess. But the evidence suggested otherwise. By the time I returned home that evening, my mind was set. I couldn't let emotions cloud my judgment. Lila and Evan thought they had the upper hand, but they were wrong. In the weeks to come, I would let them believe their plan was working. I would let Lila think she was fooling me, let Evan think he was outsmarting me. But when the time came, I would show them exactly who I was. This wasn't just about saving my life anymore. It was about dismantling the web they had woven, exposing the truth, and ensuring that neither of them would ever hurt anyone again. Because while they thought I was clueless, I was already 3 steps ahead. The morning after I followed Lila to Evan's apartment, the air in the house felt different. Heavier. She was acting cautious, her movements slower, her smile tighter. Something had shifted. I wondered if she'd picked up on the subtle changes in my demeanor, or if her own guilt was starting to crack through her carefully crafted facade. I stayed calm, sipping my coffee as she sat across from me, staring absently at her phone. She had always been good at pretending, but now I could see the cracks, the way her hand trembled slightly as she scrolled, the way her eyes darted to me when she thought I wasn't looking. Big plans today? I asked casually, watching her reaction. She looked up, startled, then forced a smile. Just some errands. Maybe lunch with Monica. Sounds nice, I said, keeping my tone even. Tell Monica I said hi. Her smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough to confirm my suspicion. She was on edge. Once she left, I went straight to the basement. The surveillance equipment was running smoothly, feeding me live footage from the cameras I had hidden throughout the house. I pulled up the microphone feed from her phone, listening in as she made a call to Monica. He's acting strange, Lila said, her voice low and anxious. Strange how? Monica asked. I don't know, Lila admitted. He's just different. Calmer. Like he knows something. Lila, you're overthinking it, Monica replied, her tone dismissive. He's clueless, remember? That's why this is going to work. Lila let out a shaky laugh, but it was forced. Yeah, you're right. I'm just being paranoid. My lips curled into a small smile. Paranoia was exactly what I wanted. That evening, I decided to push her a little further. Subtle, calculated moves to keep her guessing without giving anything away. After dinner, I leaned back in my chair, watching her as she cleared the plates. You know, I said, my tone light, I've been thinking about taking a few days off work. Maybe we could go somewhere, just the 2 of us. Her hands froze for a split second before she recovered, carrying the plates to the sink. That sounds nice, she said, her back to me. Where were you thinking? Somewhere quiet, I said, standing and moving to lean against the counter. Maybe a cabin in the mountains. No phones, no distractions. Just us. She turned to face me, her smile strained. That sounds lovely. But are you sure you can take time off? Work's been so busy lately. I'll make it work, I said, holding her gaze. We could use the time together, don't you think? She nodded, but her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Either way, it was clear she was already thinking of excuses to avoid being alone with me. The next morning, I checked the surveillance footage from the house while Lila was out. She had been pacing the living room after our conversation, biting her nails and muttering to herself. When she finally picked up her phone, her call went straight to Evan. We have to speed things up, she said, her voice sharp. I think he's onto us. Evan's laugh was cold. Relax, Lila. He's not onto anything. He's too stupid to notice what's happening right under his nose. You don't see the way he looks at me, she argued. He knows something, Evan. I can feel it. Evan sighed, his tone patronizing. You're letting your nerves get the better of you. Stick to the plan, and everything will be fine. She hesitated, then said, Fine, but if this goes wrong... It won't, Evan interrupted. Trust me. Her growing suspicion was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made her more paranoid, which worked to my advantage. But on the other hand, it could make her act impulsively, which could throw a wrench in my plan. I needed to keep her off balance without pushing her too far. That night, as we sat in the living room watching TV, I decided to test her again. During a commercial break, I turned to her and said, "You've been distracted lately. Is everything okay?" She stiffened, her eyes darting to mine. "Of course," she said quickly. "Why wouldn't it be?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "You just seem distant." She forced a laugh. "You're imagining things, Marcus. Everything's fine." I didn't press further, letting her think she had deflected the conversation successfully. But the way she avoided looking at me for the rest of the evening told me otherwise. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. The woman I had once trusted with my life had become a stranger, someone I couldn't afford to let my guard down around. But this wasn't the time for emotions. Lila and Evan thought they were in control, but every move they made only brought them closer to the trap I was setting. By the time they realized the truth, it would be too late. Because this wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about winning. The more I uncovered about Evan and his connection to Victor Kane, the more I realized I wasn't just dealing with a betrayal. It was a full-scale conspiracy. Victor Kane wasn't some run-of-the-mill criminal. He was a kingpin, a man whose name was whispered in dark corners and avoided in the light of day. And now, his web of deceit had found its way into my life. Evan wasn't just Lila's lover. He was Victor's right-hand man, a con artist who didn't just ruin lives, he ended them. Sitting in my basement, the glow of my laptop screen casting shadows on the walls, I pieced together the timeline. Evan had been targeting me for months, maybe even years. His relationship with Lila wasn't a coincidence. It was strategic. The breakthrough came late one night, as I sifted through intercepted phone calls and emails Sarah had sent me. One call in particular caught my attention. Evan was speaking with a man whose voice I didn't recognize, but whose words carried weight. "Is everything in place?" the man asked. "Yes," Evan replied. "She's completely under my thumb. The husband won't see it coming. And the assets? They'll be ours once he's gone. She'll inherit everything, and she's agreed to transfer it to me afterward." The man laughed, a deep, menacing sound. "Good. Make sure there are no loose ends. Kane doesn't tolerate mistakes." That name, Kane, confirmed my worst suspicions. Victor wasn't just orchestrating a hit on me. He was using Evan and Lila to dismantle my life piece by piece. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. This wasn't just about me anymore. If Victor Kane was involved, then my death would only be a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The next day, I met Sarah at a secure location to discuss the situation. She was already waiting for me when I arrived, her expression grim. "You were right," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Victor Kane is behind this. Evan's been working for him for years, running scams on wealthy families and funneling the money back to Kane's organization." "And Lila?" I asked, my voice tight. Sarah hesitated. "She's a pawn, Jason, but she's a willing one. She knew about the money, the scam, and even the murder plot. Whether she understood the full extent of Kane's involvement is unclear, but she's not innocent." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been holding onto a sliver of hope that Lila had been manipulated, that she wasn't fully aware of what she was doing. But now, that hope was gone. Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparing for what was to come. Lila and Evan were getting impatient, and Victor Kane's name loomed over everything like a storm cloud. I tightened the security in the house, adding hidden cameras and motion detectors in places they wouldn't think to look. I stored weapons in strategic locations, nothing flashy, just the essentials I could grab quickly if needed. Every night, I listened to their conversations. Lila was growing more anxious, her paranoia creeping into every word she spoke. Evan, on the other hand, remained calm and confident, reassuring her that everything was under control. "She's starting to lose her nerve," Evan told Kane during one call. "Then deal with it," Kane replied coldly. "She's expendable if she becomes a liability." Hearing those words made my blood boil. Lila had betrayed me, yes, but she didn't deserve to be discarded like that. Kane and Evan saw her as nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. I couldn't let that happen, not because I still loved her, but because I wasn't going to let them win. One evening, as Lila sat on the couch texting, I decided to push her a little further. "You've been distracted lately," I said, sitting down next to her. Is everything okay? She looked up, startled, then forced a smile. Of course. Just a lot on my mind. Anything I can help with? I asked, keeping my tone light. No, she said quickly. Just work stuff. Her response was too quick, too rehearsed. I nodded, letting it go, but her unease was obvious. Later that night, I intercepted another call between Evan and Victor. Everything's set, Evan said. The hit is scheduled for next week. The thugs will make it look like a robbery. Good, Victor replied. And the wife? She's on board, Evan said. But I'll keep an eye on her. She's been jumpy lately. Don't let her screw this up, Victor warned. If she becomes a problem, deal with her. By the time I turned off the surveillance feed, my mind was racing. Lila and Evan thought they had everything under control, but they had no idea what was coming. Victor Kane had underestimated me. Evan had underestimated me. Even Lila, for all her paranoia, had underestimated me. But I wasn't just a husband waiting to be taken down. I was a combat-trained FBI agent, and I was ready for war. When the time came, I wouldn't just survive. I would destroy everything they had built, and they would never see it coming. I knew it was coming. For days, I had been listening, watching, waiting for the moment when Evan's plan would move from whispers to action. The pieces were all in place. Victor Kane had approved the hit, Evan had coordinated the thugs, and Lila had unwittingly handed over every detail they needed. But they underestimated me. They thought I was clueless, an oblivious husband too blind to see the truth. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last week turning my home into a fortress, a trap they wouldn't escape from. It was late when I got the signal. A text came through on Lila's phone while she was in the kitchen, pretending to make tea but clearly stalling for time. She had been jittery all evening, her hands trembling as she moved around the house. The message was from Evan. They're on their way. Be ready. I watched her from the living room, keeping my expression neutral as she set the teapot down with a clatter. She glanced at me, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Tea should be ready in a few minutes, she said, her voice too high-pitched. Take your time, I replied, leaning back on the couch as if I didn't have a care in the world. Inside, my adrenaline was spiking. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my mind, running through every possible scenario. The weapons were hidden, the cameras were rolling, and the escape routes were blocked. I was ready. When the knock came at the door, I didn't move. Lila froze, her eyes darting to me before she forced a casual tone. I'll get it, she said, wiping her hands on a towel. I nodded, pretending to focus on the TV as she walked to the door. Through the hidden cameras, I watched her open it, her face tight with poorly masked fear. Two men stood on the porch, dressed in dark clothes and carrying the casual confidence of professionals. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered thug with a scar across his cheek, stepped inside first. Is he here? The scarred man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Lila nodded, her voice barely a whisper. He's in the living room, watching TV. The scarred man smirked, motioning for the second thug to follow him. They moved quietly, their footsteps muffled on the carpet as they approached the living room. I stayed perfectly still, letting them think I was unaware of their presence. The scarred man reached for the weapon tucked into his waistband, his movements slow and deliberate. That's when I struck. In one fluid motion, I sprang from the couch, grabbing the hidden knife I had tucked beneath the cushion. Before the scarred man could react, I slammed the blade into his thigh, twisting it to incapacitate him. He screamed, collapsing to the floor as blood poured from the wound. The second thug lunged at me, but I was faster. Using the momentum of his charge, I flipped him over my shoulder, sending him crashing into the coffee table. Lila screamed, backing away as I turned to face her. Jason, she gasped, her eyes wide with shock. What are you doing? What am I doing? I repeated, my voice cold. What are you doing, Lila? Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. The second thug groaned, trying to get to his feet, but I was on him in an instant. I pressed my boot against his chest, pinning him to the floor. Who sent you? I demanded, my voice sharp. He glared up at me, refusing to answer. I pressed harder, leaning my weight onto his ribcage. Victor Kane? I asked. Or was it Evan? His eyes flickered with fear at the mention of their names, but he still didn't speak. Fine, I said, stepping back. We'll do this the hard way. I dragged both thugs into the basement, tying them to chairs I had prepared earlier. The scarred man was still bleeding, his face pale, but he was conscious enough to glare at me. You don't know who you're messing with, he growled. I crouched down in front of him, meeting his gaze. Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with. The real question is, do you know who I am? His expression faltered, confusion replacing his bravado. That's what I thought, I said, standing. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me everything. Who sent you, what the plan was, and where I can find Victor Kane. If you don't, I glanced at the array of tools laid out on the workbench. Well, let's just say you won't like the alternative. Upstairs, Lila was still screaming, begging me to explain what was happening. I ignored her for now, focusing on the thugs. The scarred man cracked first, spilling everything I needed to know about Evan's timeline, Kane's involvement, and the resources they had at their disposal. By the time I was done with him, I had everything I needed to dismantle their operation. When I finally returned to the living room, Lila was pacing, her face streaked with tears. Jason, she sobbed, please let me explain. Save it, I said, cutting her off. I've heard enough. Her betrayal burned, but there was no time for emotions. The real fight was just beginning. Victor Kane had sent his thugs to kill me. Now, I was going to take the fight to him. The thugs sat in my basement, tied to chairs and dripping with sweat, their cocky demeanor replaced by fear. The scarred man, Jack, as I'd learned during my interrogation, glared at me with a mix of defiance and desperation. His partner, a wiry guy named Neil, had been the first to crack, spilling details about Victor Kane's operation and Evan's role in orchestrating my demise. Victor Kane had no idea who he was dealing with. Evan thought he was untouchable, and Lila, well, Lila had gotten herself tangled in something she couldn't possibly control. But now the tides were turning, and I was no longer just reacting to their plans. I was taking charge. After securing the two thugs, I went upstairs to deal with Lila. She was sitting on the living room couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. The tea she had made earlier was still sitting on the table, untouched. When she saw me, she jumped to her feet. Jason, please, let me explain. Explain what? I snapped, cutting her off. That you conspired with Evan to have me killed? That you let those two idiots into our home to finish the job? She flinched at my words, her eyes wide with panic. I didn't know it would go this far. Evan, he promised me it would be quick, that you wouldn't suffer. Quick. I laughed bitterly. You were planning to kill me, Lila. There's no such thing as quick when it comes to betrayal. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I could see the guilt written all over her face, but guilt wasn't enough. Not after everything she'd done. I walked past her, grabbing my laptop from the kitchen counter and opening it on the coffee table. The surveillance footage from the basement streamed onto the screen, showing Jack and Neil slumped in their chairs. Lila gasped. You knew? I've known for weeks, I said coldly. I've been watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment. You thought I was some clueless husband, but the truth is, I've been 10 steps ahead of you this whole time. She sank back onto the couch, her hands trembling. Jason, Save it, I said, cutting her off again. You're going to sit there and watch as I dismantle the little empire you and Evan tried to build. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never met him. I left her there, retreating to the basement to finalize my plan. Neil had been surprisingly cooperative, spilling everything he knew about Victor Kane's operations. He told me about the safe houses, the money laundering schemes, and the key players in Kane's network. He even gave me the address of Evan's private apartment, the same one I had seen Lila visiting. Jack, on the other hand, was less forthcoming. He sneered at me from his chair, blood still dripping from the wound in his leg. You think you're tough, don't you? He spat. You have no idea who you're messing with. I crouched down in front of him, meeting his gaze. No, Jack. You have no idea who you're messing with. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my FBI badge, holding it up for him to see. His eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his expression. "You're FBI?" he whispered. "That's right," I said, standing. "And now that I have everything I need, you're going to help me take down Kane and Evan, or you're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison." I called Sarah, updating her on the situation. She listened carefully, her voice calm but urgent. "You need to be careful, Jason. Kane doesn't play games. If he finds out you're onto him, he'll come after you with everything he's got." "Let him try," I said. "I'm not backing down." "Fine," she said. "But we need to coordinate this carefully. I'll mobilize a team to hit Kane's safe house, but we'll need evidence to tie him to the hit on you." "I've got that covered," I said. "Neil gave me everything I need, and I'll handle Evan personally." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Jason, don't do anything reckless." "Reckless?" I echoed. "Reckless is sitting back and letting these people tear my life apart. This ends tonight, Sarah." That evening, I confronted Lila one final time. She was still sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Jason, I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I let Evan manipulate me. I thought he loved me, but I see now that he was just using me. Please, you have to believe me." I stared at her, my expression cold. "Believe you? After everything you've done? After you plotted to kill me?" She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I didn't know how to stop it. I was in too deep. "You're right about one thing," I said. "You're in deep. And now, you're going to help me fix this." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're going to call Evan," I said, tossing her phone onto the couch beside her. "You're going to tell him everything's going according to plan. And you're going to lure him here." She hesitated, her hands shaking as she picked up the phone. "And then what?" I leaned in close, my voice low and dangerous. "Then, Lila, I make sure neither of you ever hurts anyone again." She swallowed hard, nodding as she dialed Evan's number. As she spoke to him, I watched her closely, the weight of her betrayal etched into every word she said. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. And by the time this night was over, Evan, Lila, and Victor Kane would all pay for what they'd done. Lila's trembling fingers hovered over her phone as I stood in front of her, arms crossed, waiting for her to make the call. I could see the conflict on her face, the fear of what Evan might do if she betrayed him versus the fear of what I might do if she didn't. "Jason," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this." "You don't have a choice," I replied coldly. "You got yourself into this, and now you're going to help me get us out. Call him. Now." Her hand shook as she dialed Evan's number, her breath hitching when he answered. I couldn't hear his words, but I watched as Lila's face shifted into the practiced sweetness she always used with him. "Hi, darling," she said, forcing a smile I knew was fake. "Everything's ready. You should come over tonight. It'll be safe." Safe. The word was loaded with meaning. She was signaling that I was clueless, that the plan was still in motion. Evan's voice was muffled, but I could hear the smugness even through the static. Whatever he said made Lila's face pale, but she nodded. "Yes, I'm sure. Come around 10. When she hung up, she dropped the phone onto the couch like it had burned her. "He's coming," she said, her voice trembling. "Good," I replied, turning to leave the room. "What are you going to do to him?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I stopped in the doorway, looking back at her. "Don't worry about that. Worry about yourself." The hours before Evan's arrival felt endless. I went over every detail of my plan, checking and rechecking the hidden cameras, the weapons I'd stashed around the house, and the escape routes I'd blocked off to ensure Evan couldn't run. In the basement, Jack and Neil were still tied up, their heads hanging low as they mumbled to each other. I'd left them alive for a reason. Proof. The recordings I had of their confessions would tie Victor Kane and Evan to the murder plot, ensuring they couldn't wriggle out of this. "You're making a mistake," Jack muttered as I walked past him. I stopped, turning to face him. "Enlighten me." "Kane doesn't let people walk away," he said, his voice low. "If you go after him, you're signing your death warrant." I leaned in close, my voice barely above a whisper. Then I'll make sure he doesn't get the chance. At 10 o'clock sharp, Evan arrived. I watched from the hidden cameras as he strolled up to the house, his swagger unmistakable. He didn't knock. He never did. Instead, he let himself in with the spare key Lila had given him months ago. "Lila," he called, his voice smooth and confident. "Where are you, my love?" Lila stepped out of the kitchen, her face a mask of forced calm. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Evan frowned, his sharp eyes scanning her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "I'm just nervous. About tonight." Evan smiled, cupping her face with one hand. "Don't be. By the time this is over, we'll have everything we need, and your husband will be out of the picture for good." I stepped into the room before she could respond, my presence cutting through the tension like a knife. "Funny," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I was about to say the same thing about you." Evan froze, his hand dropping from Lila's face as he turned to look at me. For a moment, he seemed genuinely shocked. Then, his trademark smirk returned. "Well, well," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "The cuckold husband finally grows a spine." "Something like that," I replied, stepping closer. Lila backed away, her eyes darting between us. "Jason, please." "Stay out of this, Lila," I snapped, cutting her off. "You've done enough." Evan laughed, pulling a gun from the waistband of his pants. "Do you really think you can intimidate me? I've dealt with men like you before. You're nothing but a—" Before he could finish, I moved. Years of combat training kicked in, and I closed the distance between us in an instant, disarming him with a swift strike to his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor as I grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. Evan's smugness evaporated, replaced by panic. "You're making a mistake," he sputtered. "Kane will." "Kane doesn't scare me," I said, my voice low and deadly, "but you should be terrified." The fight didn't last long. Evan was used to manipulating people with charm and lies, but he was no match for someone who had spent years on the front lines. Within minutes, he was on the ground, his hands zip-tied behind his back. I crouched down beside him, my face inches from his. "You thought you could destroy me," I said, "but now, you're going to help me destroy Kane. And if you don't," I trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. Evan glared at me, but he didn't respond. "You have two options," I continued. "Cooperate and walk away with a prison sentence. Or don't, and I hand you over to Kane myself." His eyes flickered with fear, and I knew I had him. Upstairs, Lila was sobbing on the couch. I ignored her for now, focusing on securing Evan and preparing the evidence for Sarah. This wasn't over yet. Kane was still out there, and I knew he wouldn't take this lightly. But for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. Evan had underestimated me. Lila had betrayed me. Kane had marked me. But now, the game was mine to win. With Evan restrained in the basement alongside Jack and Neil, the first pieces of Victor Kane's empire were falling apart. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Kane wouldn't let this slight go unanswered. He was a man who thrived on power and fear, and my survival meant I had disrupted his carefully orchestrated plans. That night, as I sat in my office, reviewing the confessions I had recorded from Evan and his thugs, I felt the weight of what was to come. Kane's network was massive, spanning multiple cities, with influence that reached into law enforcement, politics, and business. This wasn't just a simple revenge plot anymore. It was a battle against an empire, and I had no intention of losing. The first thing I did was call Sarah. Her calm, collected voice answered after the first ring. "Jason, what's the update?" "I've got Evan in custody," I said, "and I've recorded his confession. He spilled everything. His ties to Kane, the hit on me, and even the money laundering operations." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's good," she said. "But you know this means Kane will retaliate. He's not going to take this lightly." "I know," I replied. "That's why we need to act now. I need you to coordinate with the task force and hit Kane's operations while he's distracted. We can't give him time to regroup." Sarah hesitated. "Jason, you're walking a fine line here. You've already crossed personal and professional boundaries. If something goes wrong, I'm not giving him the chance to go after me again, I interrupted. We've got the evidence. Let's use it. Fine, she said finally. I'll make the calls. But you need to be careful. Kane's reach is deeper than we know. With Sarah working on the legal side, I turned my attention back to Evan. He sat in the basement, his once smug demeanor completely gone. Jack and Neil were silent, their heads hanging low, but Evan was visibly shaken. You don't understand what you're doing, Evan said as I entered the room. Kane will kill you for this. He'll kill all of us. I crouched down in front of him, my voice calm but firm. You're scared of Kane. That's obvious. But what you should be scared of right now is me. Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. I've got enough evidence to put you away for life, I continued. But if you help me bring down Kane, I might be able to cut you a deal. It's your choice. He hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the thugs beside him. If I talk, Kane will come after me. Kane won't have the chance, I said. Not if we take him down first. Over the next few hours, Evan detailed everything he knew about Kane's operations. He described the safe houses, the money laundering schemes, and the corrupt officials Kane had on his payroll. It's bigger than you think, Evan said, his voice trembling. Kane's got people everywhere. Even if you take him down, someone else will take his place. We'll see about that, I replied, recording every word. The next step was setting the trap. Kane was a cautious man, but he had one weakness, his ego. Sarah and I crafted a plan to draw him out, using the information we had gathered to disrupt his operations and force him to act. The first strike came the following morning. The task force raided one of Kane's safe houses, seizing millions in cash and arresting several of his key associates. News of the raid spread quickly, and Kane's network began to unravel. That evening, I received a call from Sarah. We've got him, she said, her voice triumphant. Kane's on the move. He's trying to cover his tracks. Good, I replied. Let's keep the pressure on. But Kane wasn't going down without a fight. That night, as I reviewed the latest intel in my basement, the power suddenly went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and my instincts kicked in immediately. Grabbing a flashlight and a weapon, I moved silently through the house, my senses on high alert. I could hear faint footsteps outside, the crunch of gravel under heavy boots. They were here. I had anticipated this. Kane's retaliation was inevitable, and I had prepared for it. As the first intruder entered the house, I waited in the shadows, my weapon at the ready. He moved cautiously, scanning the room with a flashlight, but he didn't see me until it was too late. I struck quickly, disarming him and knocking him unconscious. The second intruder wasn't as lucky. He fired a shot, but I ducked behind cover, returning fire and hitting him in the leg. He dropped to the ground with a scream, his weapon clattering across the floor. By the time the dust settled, 2 of Kane's men were unconscious, and the rest had fled. I secured the house, calling Sarah to report the incident. Kane's getting desperate, I said. He's lashing out. Which means we're close, she replied. Stay safe, Jason. We're almost there. As I sat in the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of the night's attack, Lila approached cautiously. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Jason, she said quietly, what's going to happen to us? I looked at her, my expression unreadable. That depends on you, I said. But right now, the only thing that matters is taking Kane down. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I didn't respond. The battle wasn't over yet, and there was no room for forgiveness, not now. Victor Kane had made his move. Now, it was my turn. The aftermath of Kane's retaliation left the house in shambles, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. This wasn't over, not yet. Kane had made his move, and now it was my turn to deliver the final blow. I spent the next few hours coordinating with Sarah and the task force. The intel I had gathered from Evan, Jack, and Neil had exposed Kane's most critical vulnerabilities. His network was vast, but it was also overextended, and the task force had begun dismantling it piece by piece. The safe house raid had shaken him, and now we had an opportunity to take him down for good. But Kane was slippery. He wouldn't go quietly, and I knew this confrontation would end in only one of two ways, with his empire crumbling or with my life. Evan, restrained in the basement, had been surprisingly cooperative since the raid. I returned to him one last time, standing over his chair with a cold expression. "Victor knows you've betrayed him," I said, my voice flat. "If you want any chance of surviving this, you'll need to help me end it." Evan looked up at me, his once confident demeanor replaced by fear. "I've told you everything I know," he said. "What more do you want from me?" "I want Kane," I said simply, "and you're going to help me lure him out." Evan's eyes widened. "You're insane. If I make a move against him, he'll kill me." "Not if we get to him first," I replied. "The choice is yours. Work with me, or rot in prison while Kane sends someone to finish the job." Evan hesitated, his fear warring with his self-preservation. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, I'll do it." The plan was simple but dangerous. Evan would arrange a meeting with Kane, claiming he had recovered some of the money seized in the raid and was ready to regroup. Kane, desperate to salvage what was left of his empire, would likely take the bait. The meeting was set for the following night at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Sarah and the task force would be positioned nearby, ready to move in once Kane arrived. I prepared for the encounter with meticulous care, checking my weapons, reviewing the layout of the warehouse, and rehearsing every possible scenario in my mind. This wasn't just about taking down Kane. It was about ending the nightmare he had unleashed on my life. The night of the meeting, the air was thick with tension. I arrived at the warehouse early, hidden in the shadows as Evan waited nervously near the entrance. He paced back and forth, his hands trembling as he glanced at his watch. "You're sure he'll come?" I asked through the earpiece, my voice calm but firm. "He'll come," Evan replied. "He doesn't have a choice." Minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness as a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the warehouse. Kane stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by heavily armed men. He was exactly as I'd imagined, tall, imposing, with an air of ruthless authority that demanded obedience. "Evan," Kane said, his voice cold and measured, "you'd better have a good reason for dragging me out here." "I do," Evan stammered, holding up a briefcase. "I recovered some of the cash from the raid. I thought we could use it to rebuild." Kane eyed the briefcase suspiciously. "And why should I believe you?" Evan swallowed hard, his fear palpable. "Because I know how much you need this." I watched from the shadows, my finger hovering over the trigger of my weapon. Sarah's voice came through the earpiece. "We're in position. Wait for my signal." But Kane was unpredictable. He motioned to one of his men, who grabbed the briefcase from Evan and opened it. Inside was a stack of cash, but it wasn't enough to satisfy Kane. "Is this a joke?" Kane growled. "This barely scratches the surface of what we've lost." Evan stammered, trying to explain, but Kane wasn't interested. He pulled a gun from his coat, aiming it at Evan's head. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't kill you right now," Kane snarled. That was my cue. Stepping out of the shadows, I aimed my weapon at Kane and called out, "Drop it." Kane turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he saw me. Well, he said, a smirk curling his lips. "The husband. I was wondering when you'd show up." "Hands where I can see them," I ordered, my voice steady. Kane's men raised their weapons, but before they could fire, the task force stormed in, surrounding the warehouse. Chaos erupted as gunfire filled the air. The firefight was intense, but the task force was well prepared. Kane's men were outnumbered and outgunned, and within minutes, most of them had surrendered. Kane, however, wasn't willing to go quietly. He grabbed Evan, using him as a human shield as he tried to make his escape. "Stay back," Kane shouted, his gun pressed against Evan's head. I followed them, my weapon trained on Kane. "Let him go," I demanded. "You're not in a position to make demands," Kane sneered. Evan's eyes met mine, filled with terror. For a split second, I hesitated, weighing my options. Then, with a precision born of years of training, I fired. The bullet hit Kane in the shoulder, forcing him to release Evan and drop his weapon. As the task force moved in to secure Kane, I stood over him, my heart pounding. He looked up at me, blood seeping from his wound, and smiled. You think this is over? He said, his voice weak but defiant. It's over, I replied, my voice cold. You just don't know it yet. The raid was a success. Kane and his men were taken into custody, and his empire began to crumble. Back at home, I sat in the living room, exhausted but relieved. Lila approached me cautiously, her face pale. Is it done? She asked quietly. It's done, I said, not looking at her. She hesitated. And us? I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. That depends on you, Lila. But trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I'll do whatever it takes. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my shoulders began to lift. The nightmare was over, and while the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I had survived. And I wasn't the same man I had been before.